So we're going to begin in chapter 24 in verse 1. I'm going to read a portion of this chapter because I want you to see the story, and then we will begin to comment and try to make at least the best application that we can. Remember that Saul has still been chasing David. David, his 600 men have left, and they've gone to the strongholds, as it was called in chapter 23. That must be a hilly area where there are a lot of caves. For as we begin this story, we find David and his men hidden in a cave. So let's pick it up in verse 1 and see what is happening. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all of Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. The men said, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemies into your hands for you to deal with as you wish." Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off the corner of Saul's robe. Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." With these words, David sharply rebuked his men, did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went on his way. Then David went out of the cave, called out to Saul, "My Lord the king." When Saul looked behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He said to Saul, "Why do you listen when men say, 'David is bent on harming you'? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lay my hand on my Lord, because he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, look at this piece of robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but did not kill you. See that there is nothing in my hand to indicate that I'm guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you. As the old saying goes, from evildoers come evil deeds, so my hand will not touch you." It's a classic story, isn't it? Of good versus evil, of just versus the unjust. Even more classic of a story of the innocent, the just, having over them an authority that is unjust, that is evil. And the big question comes from this story this morning for all of us to try to at least think about is, what do you and I do with authority that is over us that we don't respect, that we don't like in terms of their actions, or maybe they're just mistreating us terribly? How do you and I respond to such authority? Life is filled with authorities. In Scripture, we know that we are taught to honor our father and our mother, for they are an authority. We are taught in local congregations, for example, in the New Testament, that we're to give honor and respect to those who have been placed in authority over us. We're taught in that famous passage in Romans chapter 13 that there are authorities in our land. We have city governments, we have state governments, we have federal governments. And Romans 13 says they're allowed to be there. They're even placed there by God. And they are authority over us. But it's even more than that. When a student has gone back to school now, they have a teacher. That teacher has authority. And there are principals and there are superintendents, people in positions of authority. And then we go to work, and there are usually lines of people in authority above us in our work. The question is, how do you and I as Christians this morning respond to authority? And some of us have difficulty responding to authority even when authority is good. But what about if that authority is making poor decisions or really just becomes evil? It's tough, isn't it? Well, that's the situation that David is in. Saul has 3,000 soldiers. He's out looking for David. Likely he knows the story that David has only 600 men. He comes to this desert of En-Gedi. They come to this place where there are caves. And Saul stops his march and he goes up to a cave by himself. You and I would call it that he's going to use a private bathroom. Now it must be a really large cave because tucked into the back of that cave is David and all of his soldiers. We're assuming it's all of his soldiers. We're assuming it's the entire 600. And when Saul comes in, you can almost see the smile, the joy, the excitement coming to the soldiers of David as they say, look at what's just happened. The Lord has given him into your hands. The men see it as an opportunity to rid themselves of this plague of running. They know if Saul is gone, David's going to become king. So they're urging David, go out there and kill Saul. And if ever there would seem to be a situation where it would be right to do such a thing, it seems like David has that right. And David's been so abused by Saul. So David apparently takes something like a dagger in his hand. He creeps out, but he does not kill Saul. He cuts off a corner of his robe. Saul apparently has no idea that it's even happened. But it says David is conscience-stricken. For he says, who am I to raise my hand against the man that is anointed by God? Now what David knows is that God appointed Saul to be king. It was God who put him in that place. And David is beginning to wonder, is it my place then to remove, to kill, to destroy the one God has put in that place? He's conscience-stricken. He'll later tell Saul, I didn't rebel against you. I didn't try to harm you. I think David must understand how seriously God takes this word rebellion. Maybe he was taught all of his life about the old stories. There's an old story about Miriam. She's the sister of Moses. And in one particular passage, at one particular time, she is so disrespectful to her own brother. She rises up in rebellion against his authority. And as soon as she does it, you'll remember she was stricken with leprosy. Maybe David heard the story of men like Korah and Dathan and Abiram, and how they were so also disrespectful against Moses. And they rose up in rebellion against him. You remember what God did to them? I can't even imagine what it would have been like. He opened up the earth. They fell in. He closed the earth back up. God does not like rebellion. And David refuses in this story, though he seems in my mind to have every right, he refuses to raise his hand against whom he calls the Lord's anointed. Now the question is, how do you and I typically react against authority? What happens, I get this question all the time, what happens when you're forced to grow up in a home where your parents really aren't really good parents? In fact, they may be even evil to you. How do you honor father and mother in that circumstance? And what about in a local congregation when you disagree with the decision the elders have made, or you don't like their particular doctrinal stance, or whatever the thing might be? I've been in situations many, many times where I have been in that position. How do I react in that kind of authority situation? The big one for me right now is our government. Authorities, whether they be in the city, the state, the federal. There are many things in this government right now that are happening that I may have major disagreement with and do not like at all. How do I conduct myself as a Christian to this kind of authority? Well, I want you to notice something about David. No, he did not take matters in his own hands. He did not raise his hand against Saul. In fact, he will, in the end of this story, did you see it? He will say, let's let the Lord decide. May the Lord judge between you and me. May the Lord uphold the right in this case. Again, sideline thought, but it shows David's level of dependence, trust, and connection in God, in that he's willing to say, the Lord will remedy this. I don't have to. But in between those two times, did you notice what David did? David was not silent. He may not have killed Saul. He may not have harmed Saul, but he was not silent. In a most respectful and humble way, he spoke the truth of the matter to Saul. When he goes out of the cave, did you see it? He calls Saul his master. Not only that, he fell down to the ground. He put his face next to the ground as he addressed Saul, a sign of humility, a sign of respect. But do you hear what he said to Saul? He said, Saul, why do you believe all these stories when people say I'm trying to harm you? You know that's not true. I've not done anything that's been rebellious against you, that would bring harm to you, and yet you continue to pursue me, trying to kill me. And then he makes that little statement, from evildoers come evil deeds. Now, we didn't read the end of the story, but Saul will be convicted for a moment of David's loyalty to him and the truth of David's words. It won't last, but for the moment, he's convicted of it. It makes me think today about how you and I deal with all these things that are so wrong around us. Rebellion, I don't think that's the right word, the right tactic. But somehow speaking the truth and remaining respectful does seem appropriate right now. Maybe you're like me. Maybe you're dismayed. Maybe you can hardly believe what you see happening in our country. And I know that it's not typical for me to speak directly about what happens in our country. Everyone I've heard talk believes that there was a man who was killed by a police officer who should not have been killed. That was a wrong tactic. And according to this story, maybe it's okay that people voice their concern and voice their protest against such mistreatment. But when that goes over into the world of extreme violence, burning things down and killing people and stealing things that don't belong to you, where is the right in all that? I see a lot of wrong in it, but where's the right in all that? If you've paid much attention to the news, you know this last week was the anniversary of the famous speech made by Martin Luther King, that I Have a Dream speech. It's said to be, and likely is, one of the greater speeches ever given in the history of our country. It's interesting to me that Martin Luther recognized the unjustness of his society in his day. He recognized how some things were so wrong and some people were being so mistreated by the authorities even. And he called for people to speak up in one voice against that which is unjust. But he also called for people to do it without violence, in love, with respect. Somehow that major part of his speech has been forgotten. Martin Luther King was a preacher. I find myself wondering, had he read this story multiple times? Had he too contemplated the gravity of this story? Now you're able to see, I suppose, the difficulty I'm having in applying this story to my own life. And maybe you're having difficulty knowing how to apply it to your life. These are the kind of stories at times I want to brush over, skip over, but it's so applicable to where we live today. There needs to be, right now in America, there needs to be a voice for right and a voice against wrong. And we need to speak up for who we are. But we have to do it by the example of David, by the warning of Scripture, by the teaching of New Testament Scripture, that we are a people of peace, we are a people of righteousness, we are a people of godliness, we are people who respect authority. But we can speak up if we do it in the right way. I don't know what that means to you. I'm trying to figure out how I apply it to my own life. But I want to be right with God. So I want to honor my father and my mother the best I can. I want to honor the leaders of a local congregation the best I can. I really want to give honor and respect to people God has allowed to be in positions of authority all across our country. But I'm kind of refusing right now to be silent on what I see as wrong. Hopefully I'll learn how to do it with respect and kindness. I hope you'll do the same thing. But it's a lesson, a biblical lesson for all of us to think about. Easy? No. Did I want to speak it? No. But I really think we need to consider how David reacted to a man who had authority appointed by God, but was so very evil and so very wrong. He spoke up, but he did not take matters into his own hands to violence. He had the confidence in God to say, God, will you deal with this? Months ago, we were reading from the Psalms before the virus all broke out. We were all so amazed at how David would speak so frankly to God in his prayer life. And he would say, God, these people are trying to kill me. These people are trying to destroy my reputation. These people are doing me so much harm. Will you deal with them? Will you make the wrong to be right? Even to the point, will you destroy them? When David spoke to God, he poured out his heart that God would act for that which was right. Maybe that's a starting place for all of us too.